Okay, we have reached 11 o'clock British summertime, so we shall begin. Welcome to our latest webinar, and thank you very much for joining us. I hope, first of all, very much hope you are well and you're staying safe during this difficult time. First of all, we're going to do a very brief introduction. You don't need to know much about me, but it's nice to put a face to a voice, shall we say. My name is Phil Underwood. I'm the engagement manager here at the Society for the Environment. Like I said, you don't need to know much about me, but if you have questions and so on after the webinar, then they're the details on your screen that you can get in touch with me via. The webinar is being recorded and will be available in the coming days via our website, our YouTube channel, and if you have opted in to receive emails from us, you will receive an email with the recording link as well. For those watching the webinar as a recording, if you have any questions, once again, please feel free to contact me using the contact details on your screen at the moment. So very quickly, you're watching a Society for the Environment webinar. We hold the 2 professional registers for environmental professionals, the Chartered Environmentalist or CEnv register, and the Registered Environmental Technician or REnvTech register. The Society operates as an umbrella organisation, currently made up of 24 professional bodies, also known as our licensed members. All of these professional bodies hold a licence granted by the Society to award the CEnv registration to their members, and 3 of them also offer the Registered Environmental Technician registration to their members as well, which are highlighted on your screen now. To become a CEnv or an REnvTech, you will need to be a member of one of these professional bodies and apply via one of the professional bodies. You'll be joining nearly 7,500 registrants from across sectors, disciplines, international borders, and so on. And as of this week, we have registered 10,000 Chartered Environmentalists in total. To give you a bit of an idea of what's going on at the moment. If you want to find out more about becoming a CEnv or an REnvTech, please visit the socenv.org.uk website or inquire with the relevant professional body directly. So moving swiftly on, the aim of our numerous webinar series is to increase knowledge transfer opportunities for environmental professionals and interested parties. We even started them a few years before the Zoom revolution, so ahead of the game maybe, who knows. This webinar is the 3rd of a 4-part series based around the topic of climate change, a 2020 perspective. Today we are focusing on global water security, which I'm going to make the assumption is impacted upon by climate change. Today's speaker is Roger Falconer, who is the Emeritus Professor of Water Engineering at Cardiff University and an independent water consultant with Roger Falconer Water Consultancy. Roger is a Chartered Environmentalist via ICE, which is the Institution of Civil Engineers. So a huge welcome to Roger. Are you with us?
Yes.
Welcome, Roger. Thank you for joining us.
Can you hear me?
I can indeed. Yes, yes. So I'll allow you to provide any further introduction as you wish, but essentially, it's over to you.
Thank you, Phil. Good morning, everyone. My name is Roger Falconer. I have spent 40 years in academia, firstly at the University of Birmingham, then at the University of Bradford, and most recently for the last 25 years at Cardiff University. I've mainly focused on modelling flow, water quality, sediment transport processes in rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters. And in more recent times, I've become interested in particular in global water security and the need for us to consider water in an international context. And in the second part of my talk, I'm going to focus on UK example of how we need to apply the principles of looking at water security globally to the catchment to coast scale. So I'm first going to talk about the international issues relating to global water security and why we need to put water security back at center stage, in my view, alongside climate change. So if we first look at water availability, you might wonder why we're concerned about water security, By the way, I should emphasize that what I'm talking about here in terms of security is the security of high quality water for drinking, etc. We have limited availability. On the one hand, you might wonder why we're thinking in the context of global water security when we have 1.4 billion cubic kilometers of water. On the other hand, only 35 million cubic kilometers of water exists in the freshwater state, and most of that is wrapped up in ice. So the total volume of water on the planet that is available in terms of water security today is only 0.01% of the total volume. And if you look at the Earth on the left-hand side of this picture, this little dot at the bottom shows you in a relative context, relative to the size of that circle, the amount of water that's available for freshwater supply. I'm not actually going to concentrate too much on climate change. I'm going to assume that that's well and truly understood and that other speakers will have covered that in the past. But the Stern Stern report in 2006, and more recently the IPCC 2019 report, expect the global temperature to rise of the order of 1.5 degrees if we can try to keep it down to that level by the end of this century. And that would correspond to sea level rise of the order of 80 plus centimeters, although increasingly I'm finding more and more people are working in terms of design calculations to over a meter. One of the things that fascinated me most was a lecture given by Sir John Beddington in 2009, when he talked about the perfect storm arising over the next 20 years then, which was in 2030. And he talked about the population rise, which for various reasons has not been discussed much until fairly recently. Perhaps in the Brexit discussions, it came up with the context of the UK. But the expected rise between 2009 and 2030 was from 6 to 8 billion. And we're already at 7.8 billion now. And by the end of this century, it's expected to increase to 11, nearly 12 billion. Now, this increase in the population will mean that by 2030, relative to 2009, we need to increase our food demand and supply by 50%, our energy supply by 50% as well, and we need 30% more water. Now, when it comes to global water security, we have a number of key challenges. I could have produced 20 or 30 slides along the lines of this one here, but I've just taken two pictures. The first one shows that the ancient Romans had actually got better water quality than half the people alive now. And even if I just come to the Western developed countries like the UK, I live in Ilkley in Yorkshire, and the River Wharfe flows through my village or small town. And in the summer months when many children are in the water paddling, and well, they wouldn't easily be able to swim, the river's too shallow, but certainly paddling, the fecal indicator organism levels are up at 40,000 plus. So even in a well-developed country with high levels of water treatment, we do still have quite high levels of fecal contamination in some of our rivers. The second point of this slide is of the fresh water that's available today, 70% of that fresh water is used and devoted to agriculture. So if we've got to find another 50% water, then we really need to focus on agriculture and how can we refine the amount of water or get more crop per drop. So if I can just give you some facts, most of these facts are recent. I haven't got the references, but you can see where my sources come from. 1.2 billion people today on this planet have no access to safe drinking water, and 0.5 million children die annually of diarrhea. It's extremely rare that a child would die in my country of diarrhea, and therefore we have the means and the capabilities of addressing this problem, but for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to be addressed because there's no significant sign of this figure dropping. 2.4 billion people have no access to basic sanitation, and 3.5 million people die annually from waterborne disease. We can see the issues of the pandemic at the moment because it's hit the Western world, US and so forth. But in many parts of the world, these large numbers of deaths that we're currently seeing, certainly in the UK and US, for example, are not untypical, certainly in Africa, for example. Women in developing countries often have to walk typically 5 kilometers daily to get 5 gallons of water for the family. Even in the 21st century, this is really quite a surprising fact. Flooding causes many deaths globally. I usually like to take the example of the Aceh earthquake in 2004, when a tsunami producing a wave typically 30 meters high was propagated at a speed of 500 miles per hour, the speed of a 747 jet. It took 3 hours for that tsunami to get from Indonesia to Sri Lanka. And with all the technology we have on the planet today, we couldn't warn literally millions of people to get onto higher ground because the tsunami was going to come their way. And that could have easily been done through a mobile phone. So we could have easily warned people, but we weren't able to do that. So this is perhaps an example where individual countries are quite capable of addressing these issues, but when it comes to addressing issues at a global scale, we don't have that capability. 250,000 people lost their lives, or thereabouts, depends which article you read, but 250,000 people were thought to have lost their lives in the Aceh earthquake tsunami. And half the hospital beds filled with people at any one time are from people suffering from water-related diseases. So there are a whole range of really major global issues here, which bring us back to the challenges associated with water security. Now, when we look at water security, we really need to look at the link and the nexus between water, food, and energy. We need water to produce food, and we need food for energy, the energy of the human being, for example. We need water for energy, we need hydropower stations, and so on. So I would argue that we cannot just consider the carbon footprint, as we are rightly doing at the moment in isolation, without also considering the knock-on impacts on the water footprint, because I believe this is quite a significant issue when we look at global issues. So some of the pressures on water resources are summarized in this slide. Climate change is leading to significant challenges. We are all familiar with these challenges, and they're documented almost on the news, certainly weekly, if not more frequently than weekly. The population, we know, is going to increase by about 40% to about 11 billion by the end of this century, 2100. There are big shifts in the population, shifting from rural areas, to big cities, and these cities are getting bigger and bigger. London, when I was young, was one of the biggest cities in the world. Today, with a population of about 8 million, it's very low down on that list. And more young people are moving to the large cities, and most of these large cities are located around the coast. Food production is going to need to be increased by 40% over the next 50 years. We need an awful lot of water to produce industrial commodities, and the industrial demand, as we become richer globally, is going to require larger energy resources, and we need more water for those energy resources. As the world becomes richer, and I've seen this in my own lifetime, we have more disposable income. More disposable income means more goods can be purchased, and people are changing their diets. And I've seen this in many countries across the world where people have shifted from very basic diets, or what many would regard as very basic diets, to more westernized diets, including meat consumption, for example. I've chosen meat consumption here because if we look at the water required to produce meat, 1 kilogram of beef will require typically 15,000 liters of water. 1 kilogram of wheat, in contrast, only requires 1/15 of that, 1,300 liters of water. So I'd like to turn now to the typical water cycle. And we can see here that the cloud has a high level of rain particles. Those rain particles fall on the land. It then flows, the blue water line here flows through rivers, lakes, aquifers, and only 36% of that original 100% ends up going into the ocean at the estuarine end of the river basin. So some of that water goes into the soil, and some of the water is taken off for irrigation to produce food. Now, this food can be used and consumed by people within that country, which is domestic consumption, or it can be exported. And this is where we introduced what's called virtual water. It's water used in one country to supply a commodity for another country, which in this case is taken to be food. Water can also be taken off in this section here, going up to industry, for example, producing products like cars, for example. And those cars can be purchased internally within that country, which means that the water from that particular river passing through that country is used for domestic consumption, car consumption in this case. All those cars can be sold overseas, producing exports, and then we have virtual water. So if, for example, someone in the UK buys a car from another country, then that person has consumed a large amount of water in that country in producing that commodity. So if we look at the water footprint is the water, we define this as the water that's consumed, in other words, used by people like you and I for showering, bathing, and so forth, drinking, and also used to produce goods and services, clothes, cars, and so on, within a particular country. Now, within any particular country, we have two components. We have the internal water footprint. So if we just take the UK, for example, where I'm based, the river flows through the UK. We take the water off, we take it to the home, we use it to bath and so forth, then we put it back in. That's the internal water footprint. So I consume typically 150 litres of water a day. The external water footprint is what I use through purchasing commodities. For example, the shirt I've got on now is a cotton shirt. We don't produce any cotton in this country. And the cotton produced for this shirt, the cotton grown, to produce this shirt will have been produced in another country. So that's the external water footprint. That's the water in another country which has been used to produce the cotton for the shirt that I have on at the moment. So the water footprint of a nation, let's take, for example, the UK, is the water used internally, bathing, showering, and so forth, consumed by the animals, plus the virtual water imported. So if I buy this shirt, for example, I've imported virtual water, I've used water in another country, let's say India, I'll come back to this in a minute. And then, of course, there are products that we produce in the UK where we use UK water and we supply those products to other countries. So that water is then taken away, that's exported. So if we look at the UK water footprint, we see on the left-hand side, the darker blue, we see the internal water footprint, 36. It doesn't matter about the figures, but if you look below, the household consumption is relatively small. So even reducing our household consumption, I consume, let's say, 150 litres a day, which is the average figure at the moment. Even if we drop that by 20, 30%, we're not going to make a big difference to the internal water footprint. Much more of our consumption is based on agriculture and to a lesser extent industry. However, if we look at the external water footprint, none comes from the domestic household. A very large chunk comes from agriculture, 46.4 of 63.6, and industrialists being 17.2. So now I'd like to take a couple of examples to look at the water footprint, if I may. 1 cup of coffee, and we don't produce coffee in this country, this, let's say, would come from Brazil, for example, requires 140 litres of water in another country, let's say Brazil. So when I go to Starbucks or somewhere like Starbucks and buy a cup of coffee, I've actually consumed 140 litres, or the best part of 140 litres of water in Brazil. That's my virtual water footprint. If I then have a steak, I consume 26 bars of water. This is the whole system, transporting the beef and so forth. So we look at lamb, for example. We can buy lamb in this country, and it comes from, very often that lamb comes from New Zealand. So we will have consumed a massive amount of water in New Zealand to produce a joint of lamb for consumption in the UK. But the one I want to turn to in particular is cotton. When we talk about producing jeans, for example, or clothes or dresses for women and suits for men, if they're cotton-based, we're easily up into the sort of 73 bars of water, as is typical here for a pair of jeans. Each bath contains 150 litres of water. So we're talking about this pair of jeans requiring 10,850 litres of water to produce the cotton jeans. Now, I picked cotton deliberately because we produce no cotton in the UK. And this is the point where I want to draw out how we have a huge impact globally in the UK on water consumption and water quality in another country. So let me stick with cotton as an example, if I may. Most people in the UK are wearing clothes, which, not all clothes, but most of those clothes will be cotton-based. If you go to a wardrobe in the UK and look at the clothes, most of them will be cotton. So if we look at where most of the cotton is produced, it's produced mainly in India. This is where the European Union gets its cotton from, Uzbekistan and Egypt. And most of that cotton is coming from Uzbekistan, for example, in this diagram here. This is water from the rivers. So water is used from the rivers here to grow the cotton, which comes into the European Union. Also from India, these are the big suppliers, and the other one being Egypt, which is here. And if this is not managed properly, this is the consequence of the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea was a very large sea in Kazakhstan. It's now pretty well disappeared. It's not available anymore in any significant way for fishing and other producing other commodities. And it can't even be foods in that case. And it can't be used either anymore for cotton. So cotton consumption in Kazakhstan has dropped dramatically. The lake, the huge, relatively large lake, has been completely lost. So the consumptive use in one place, for example, within the European Union, the huge amount of cotton needed in the European Union has had a massive impact on the future water resources in Kazakhstan. And this is one of many examples. I could give you a lot of examples. And part of the problem is the cost of cotton clothing in the UK, for example, is relatively cheap. I can go to many relatively good quality stores here in the UK and I can buy a shirt for £20. And that is very cheap. It hasn't gone up much in many, many years. If I want to design a label, of course, things are different. But this is part of the problem. The quality standards and the treatment of the water after the cotton is produced is thrown back into the river of relatively poor quality. There is no pressure to improve the water quality when it goes back into the system. And that's one of the reasons why people like myself are able to buy shirts relatively cheaply. I would personally be quite happy to pay more for a shirt if I felt that it was coming from a country where the water was treated before it went back into the stream. So this is a sketch from India, for example, or maybe Egypt, I can't remember offhand, but the water, you can see the discoloration of the water. That goes down into the stream, from the stream to the river, and then usually much further downstream, there are children swimming in the river or cleaning in the river and so forth. So that's one of the key problems. The next problem is, if you go to an engineering department in universities pretty well anywhere around the world, in my experience, the very bright students are always very enthusiastic to work on, in fluid mechanics, for example, turbulence modeling, and they really want to design state-of-the-art Formula One cars which can produce engines more effectively than last year and so on. That's every engineer's dream, or most engineers' dreams. And if you look at the developments made in the car industry, they are phenomenal. Pretty well, my wife and I have replaced her car every 3 or 4 years, and pretty well every 4 years, when buy the same car, Volkswagen Golf, the energy efficiency, the petrol consumption efficiency of the car has increased dramatically. When you look at irrigation, however, and we're talking about getting 70% of our fresh water is wrapped up in agriculture, the advancements are nowhere near in the same scale. We don't have the very state-of-the-art sophisticated equipment. If you offer projects to final year students on improving irrigation efficiency, there's no long queue of project students outside your door to do these projects. But actually, working in these sorts of project areas, in my view, can be much more inspiring and much more satisfying than fiddling around with the Formula One car. And these projects offer huge opportunities to address water security for the future and save far more lives as an individual than any medic will ever save in his or her life. So this is one type of project which I'm aware of going on in the US at the moment, where they're trying to develop food in the form of vertical farming. So in very high quality, this is not the best of examples, but in very high quality, almost operating theatre quality rooms or houses where everything is controlled. And the water consumed, the water needed to produce these foods, this is kale, is only 1% of the food needed to grow through normal farming. So, in summary of this part, the general conclusions for water security, the security of clean water supply will become an increasing challenge over the rest of this century due to two major processes ongoing: climate change and also population growth. We need more food in particular. The water footprint, and in particular the virtual water footprint, needs to be better understood by the public and key stakeholders. Most people in the UK are focusing more on turning the tap off when they're cleaning their teeth and so forth, which is really just tinkering at the 10th decimal place of our water consumption. We are one of the biggest consumers of virtual water of any country on the planet, except for Israel, Singapore, and a couple of other countries. In contrast, a man can read the news, for example, every day of the week, wear a dark suit, a white shirt, and nobody would question the fact that that man has worn the same clothes every day of the week. If the newsreader were to be a woman and she were to wear the same dress every day of the week, people would comment that that person is wearing the same dress. The virtual water footprint of wearing a different dress every day of the week to read the news is huge compared to the man wearing the same suit every day of the week. So we have to educate people and maybe try to get the public to think a little bit more in terms of their impact on virtual water. And are they going to buy clothes which they are going to use and wear in the future, which is fine? Or are they going to decide a few days later, well, I'm not going to wear this again, and put it in the wardrobe and never use it again? Because someone has probably had significant illness from the adverse effects of the virtual water in another country. And major technological advances need to be made to make water used much more efficiently. Irrigation is a good example. If we devoted one fraction of the technological expertise that goes into the Formula One car into irrigation, we would have far more water on this planet today, and that 70% of water used for agriculture would drop dramatically. We have a long way to go, and if the water consumption could drop as much as the petrol efficiency of a car engine, that would in itself make a big difference. So we have a lot to do in educating the public in improving water security. And as you can see, we in the UK, when we buy cotton clothes, for example, that has a huge impact on water quality in India, Egypt, Uzbekistan, and so forth. So water security is needs an integrated water management approach across the global scale. So we do need to think of the impact that we have in the UK, for example, on countries like India, Egypt, and so on. Now, I hope you can see from that short introduction, and I often give lectures just on that topic alone, how we need to think about water, not just in terms of the water consumption in the UK, but our impact as UK citizens on global water. Now I want to turn to an example within the UK where if we're looking at water security within a particular site, including, for example, flooding, we should not just look at the problems in that particular community. We need to look at the whole river catchment and the river basin on a holistic basis. And this is my point of my title, that we need a holistic approach. So in the same way that we need a holistic approach to virtual water and products we buy in the UK and the impact on other countries, when we look at the water security of a river basin, we need to look at the whole of the river basin from the catchment to the coast. Now, I've worked probably for the last 25 years or so, more than that, 30 years, on a project on and off on the Ribble River Basin in the UK, which has an impact on the coastline in Bradford. Now, the River Ribble flows into an estuary called the Ribble Estuary in the northwest of England. You can see it here. It's in this basin. The northwest is here. And this is Blackpool, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. And there is a compliance point at Lytham St. Anne's, just at the edge of the estuary here. Now, the compliance points are points where we check the water quality throughout the bathing season for fecal indicator organisms. Now, Blackpool is one of the most popular seaside resorts in the UK, And this shows you a picture of the number of people on that beach in 2018. And you can see there are many children in the bathing waters here. And children in particular are vulnerable to gastroenteritis, upset stomachs and so forth from fecal contamination in waters. So it is really important that we maintain high quality coastal waters in the Blackpool Fylde Coast region. And this shows you how crowded that beach was back in 1965. So in 1965, we didn't have people from the UK going to Spain and Portugal and so forth for holidays. They were tending to take their holidays in the UK. But even today, you can see from the colour picture that the Blackpool Seaside Resort is very densely populated. So in the 1990s, there were failures of the bathing beaches in Blackpool to meet the 1976 EU Bathing Water Directive. The fecal coliform levels were exceeding the compliance levels. This was thought to be due to storm sewers and sewage works discharging along the coast. That's this coast here, the whole of this coast, from Fleetwood up here down to the south. And the combined storm sewers and sewer overflows discharging into the watercourses and rivers were not really thought to be a major problem. Extensive field surveys were undertaken to establish the inputs and failure levels at the compliance points, but the surveys didn't really provide definitive conclusions as to what was the cause of the problem. Data could not allow for impact of future proposed capital works as well. So we couldn't work out from the data what would be the impact on future works. So in the 1990s, computer models were just starting to come into play. United Utilities, or Northwest Water as it then was, a public company, they invested 500 million in the early 1990s. They built 500 million pounds, about 650 million US dollars. They built 3 new wastewater treatment plants. Those are the red squares. They put in 5 new pumping stations, but still they had non-compliance at the bathing water point, which is about here. So we undertook studies, early studies, and then more refined studies later on. And those were involving developing our Hydroenvironmental Research Centre at Cardiff University, our hydroenvironmental modelling tools. We wanted to quantify the impacts of the sewage inputs along the Ribble Estuary on the bathing waters of the Fylde coast. We investigated the influence of various parameters such as tides, winds, rivers, flows, and non-compliance. We looked at continuous and intermittent inputs. We included urban and rural changes and CSO inputs as boundary conditions. But we focused primarily on the Fylde coast, and we didn't go that far up the river. At the time, that didn't seem to be a problem. We had the tidal limit. We only went to the tidal limits of the rivers Ribble, Darwen, and Douglas. Computing costs were very expensive in those days, of course. They've come down dramatically since. The seaward boundary, we went out to the 25-metre contour in the Irish Sea. The rivers went from 10 metres up into the coastal region where the limit was more like 40 kilometres. There were a number of CSOs discharging into the rivers. And also there was a very complex wetting and drying process in a very dynamic estuary. You can see the estuary below this picture here. This is full at high tide and pretty well empty at low tide. So it was a very complex basin to model in the early 1990s. Nevertheless, we still had very good results. The water levels you can see on the top here agreed well. The currents predicted below, this is just one side, I could show you many, agreed well. And we then went on to model fecal coliform. At this stage, we just treated it as a constant, the decay rate as a constant. We just picked up manuals from the US EPA and so forth. And at those days, we thought the modeling, the hydrodynamic modeling is the most important thing of all. We spent a lot of time refining the friction coefficients and so on to the 10th decimal place. But when it came to the biology and the epidemiology, we just assumed in those days that we could just pick this up from a textbook and everything would be fine. Well, we got quite good results. Too good in many ways for an academic. As an academic, the last thing you want is good results, good agreement between your computer model and your field data, because it's very difficult to justify any more funding going into your modeling tools. There's one noticeable difference here. At dry river flows, in other words, it's not been raining for days, you can see that the fecal coliform levels coming down the river Ribble are down below 1,000. And the model is predicting that. When we come to wet river flows, and we've had rain over the preceding days, we're up at 40,000, for example, as we're seeing now in the river nearby where I live in rainfall events in the summer months. And here you can see that the actual cause of the non-compliance under dry river flows, there is no non-compliance issue at the compliance point at Lytham St. Anne's. However, under wet river flows, we can see here that yellow, which is failure, passes the compliance point. So now we can see what the problem is. The problem appears to be the river. Not all the investments, although many of the investments were needed by North West Water at the time, but they have not really addressed the non-compliance issue at Lytham St. Anne's. So in later years, though, it was clear that the compliance point at Lytham St. Anne's was going to fail the new Bathing Water Directive coming into play in 2015. So we now needed to take on board a repeat of this study, but go much further back into the river and find out what was the cause of the real problems in the river, causing the levels to come down at 40,000 in wet weather conditions. So the EU Water Framework Directive was going to be much higher. There was concern about the impact of recent land use changes in the catchments. We needed to include the catchment characteristics all the way from the top of the catchment right down to the coastal environment, just in the same way that we needed to have holistic studies for global water security. Now we need to have holistic studies for the whole, or integrated modeling right from the top right down to the coast. And we needed to model both rural and urban catchment inputs, including land use and asset changes. So our particle of rain falls down from the top. It then falls on something like a cowpat, for example. It doesn't know whether it's in the catchment, the sewer, the groundwater, the 1D river model, the 2D estuary, or the 3D ocean model. So we want to model right from the cloud here, or the catchment, right through the system out into the coast, where we're going to design and build our long sea outfall. So the objectives of the new study were to develop an integrated model from catchment to coast, estimate the urban point and diffuse source pollution loads all the way along from the coast right back up to the top of the catchments, collect new data, calibrate and validate the models. We now were working with epidemiologists, so we were getting much better biological representation of decay processes and so forth. We weren't any longer just treating the decay as constant, and we wanted to produce recommendations for policy. So here we have an example of the model going right to the outer boundary. The bay is a large bay. We were going right up to the catchments, right up all these catchments up here. We extended the 3D coastal model, including tides, waves, sediment, and E. coli processes, and climate and land use change impacts were considered in the catchments. So we used our own 3D Hydro-Environmental Research Centre model for the Irish Sea. We linked that to our 2D, 3D HRC model in the basin of particular interest, that's the coastal basin. We then modeled the catchments here right from the top using the HSPF model and our own 1D, 2D river model developed by a Chinese postdoc. And we used the InfoWorks model Sheffield University did to provide us with the inputs, both flow and CSO inputs and fecal levels, E. coli levels in this case, from this works. Here we can see the 28 different catchments we modeled, which varied dramatically. Some were rural, some were urban. Some had steep slopes, some had mild slopes. Some were used for arable land, and some were forested and so forth. So each one of these catchments had to be modeled separately. Field data was collected along the coast using ADCPs. Dye tracer studies are shown below to work out the values for dispersion coefficients, for example. Drogue tracking was undertaken, irradiance was measured, sediment samples were taken in a big way. And here's the source of inputs we were finding from the catchments. We get cowpats. Here, for example, the farmer spreads the manure or fertilizer over the land, so it's spread much more uniformly. The cow goes into the river. That's very common in the UK, although farmers are under increasing pressure to fence off the rivers. And then we have septic tanks from the farms in rural areas. All of these are adding high levels of E. coli into the catchments. To model the inputs, we used the bacteriological indicator tool from the US. That's the BIT spreadsheet. We used that's in the catchment areas. We used InfoWorks to provide the inputs from the rivers, from the CSOs. This went through an urban FIO generator, and this went into HSPF. These inputs came into the 1D, 2D river network model, and then into the 2D, 3D model. Now, the US EPA bacterial indicator tool splits the subcatchments up into mountainous, health bog, pasture land, etc. It includes stocking densities for animals, FIO production rates, decay of the production FIO, manure application, wildlife, etc. It includes continuous and point sources, point source being septic tanks, cattle and streams, for example, wash off, applied manure, grazing, wildlife, other default values. So we found this a very useful tool for analyzing the catchments. So when we came to compare the predictions of the water levels downstream and the discharges, this is just one site, but we can see on the whole, the red is predicted and the blue is measured. We generally got pretty good agreement for the water levels. We have pretty good agreement for the suspended sediment concentrations as well. And we included suspended sediment concentration modeling in this study. However, previously to this, we never thought that sediment transport was would have a major impact on E. coli levels. And so most model studies done today across the world of water quality predictions with regard to hydroepidemiological modeling do not include inputs from suspended sediments. Anyway, we felt it was important to look at this for this particular site, although we were not expecting sediments to have much impact. And there we made a very big mistake. So the boundary inputs for the coastal models are specified on this sheet. I won't dwell on those. We found that the T90 values, the time for 90% decay of E. coli from laboratory measurements, hundreds of samples were taken. And we can see here in fresh water, the T90 value in dark conditions is pretty well, doesn't decay. In light conditions, in saline water, it decays very rapidly. And here you can see the differences. When we then predicted the water levels, again, we got good agreement in the coastal waters, good comparison with the ADCP, and generally pretty good agreement with the tracer velocities as well, although that was obviously much more dependent on the 3D characteristics. We also got good agreement between the suspended sediment concentrations and the E. coli. However, we included in the suspended sediment concentrations adsorption and desorption. And here we find one of our major findings from this study, that actually suspended sediments and sediments, bed sediments, is a major mechanism of transporting E. coli and fecal bacteria from the catchment right at the top of the stream down into the coastal basin. You can see here the green line at a particular site in the river. Green shows the fecal coliform, the E. coli in the river water column, the total. The blue line is the fecal concentration in the E. coli concentration in the water column, and the red line shows that on the suspended sediments, which is then desorbed into the river channel. So we were finding before that we were under-predicting the E. coli levels in the coastal waters. When we included sediment transport, it included this as a mechanism using fairly crude coefficients at the moment for particle bacteria interactions through adsorption and desorption, for example. And clearly this is an area which needs a lot more research in the future. So in conclusion, the FIO levels in the Ribble estuary and along the Faecal coast were highly dependent upon inputs from the catchments. The adsorbed fecal indicator organisms on the suspended sediments was a very important mechanism for transporting E. coli through the Ribble basin. The stormwater and CSO inputs can be less critical in affecting beta water quality than the diffuse source inputs, certainly in parts of this basin. Improved water quality in the rivers requires better land management and improved farming practices. So, for example, fencing off the rivers is something we should be doing now with many of our farms. And complex computer models are essential for improved water quality and security, including flooding, but these models need to go right from the top of the catchment and look at the whole system and not just the coastal region that we might be particularly interested in where the children will go bathing. So thank you very much for your attention. And now I'll be pleased to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Roger. I was just locating my mute button just there. So thank you very much for that. Really interesting talk. And like you say, you do a talk on one element of that talk normally. So there's quite a lot of content into one webinar, which is really good. So thank you very much for that. As Roger says, we are now going into questions and answers. So if you haven't already done so, now is the time to ask a question to Roger. And if you can use the Q&A function in your toolbar, that would be fantastic. Don't use the chat function. We won't pick up any questions in there. And we'll do our best to get through as many as we can before 12 o'clock. So whilst we're waiting for some questions to come in, and we have had some already, we did ask you if you wanted to ask any questions upon registration for the webinar. So we're just going to ask one of those to begin with. So Roger, what are your thoughts on ensuring that water security is applied through a multidisciplinary lens, which I guess I've touched on a bit during the webinar content itself, but.
Well, I think we have to look at the whole system. We have to, historically, I think part of the problem has been that engineering companies have done the modeling for water quality modeling and water security of rivers and so forth. And that has been done by people who've had historically and primarily individuals in teams who have had a training in fluid mechanics, hydraulics, and so forth. These problems are multidisciplinary. So we need to understand the hydrodynamics. We need to understand the water quality processes. We need to understand the sediment transport processes. We need to understand the biochemistry and the decay of these processes. We need to collect masses of data. And I see many people going out collecting data regularly in many countries in the world. And you think to yourself, well, this is just a complete waste of everybody's time. They may go out only once a month to collect the data, which is useless. And there's a whole host of reasons why in solving the problems of water quality, for example, in rivers, bathing waters, it needs to consist of a very complex team of relatively specialized people and working as a strong team. And I think that's the best way we will clean up our rivers and our seas and so forth. The
key for many environmental issues, I guess, bringing together a multidisciplinary approach full of experts.
I would like to add that most consulting engineering companies that I work with are already aware of this, and they're not. In the old days, the consultants would just come to a university department and recruit graduates in engineering. Today, that team consists of engineers, biologists, chemists, and so forth.
Right, I see. I'm going to skip straight on to some questions that have been asked live because they're a bit more specific to what you've spoken about, really. So, first of all, can you expand a little bit more on the definition of water security beyond water quality?
Yes, I mean, I focus on water quality here, but I could equally address the issues of flooding. For example, in many cases now, we have dams built some considerable distance upstream. And let me just go back a stage. When I say water security here, I mean, you've got a city at the end of your river basin, usually by the coast. You've got, well, 10 million today is not a particularly large city. You've got a city with 10 million plus people. They need water for consumption. They need large volumes of good quality water. Historically, that water has tended to come from building a dam some considerable distance upstream. And that dam then releases water much further downstream. The dam is often full. The rain comes, you have very big floods, and you have significant flooding problems. There's a lot to be said for effectively removing that dam these days and building a very large reservoir in the estuary itself to provide water supply. Shanghai does this. They have a big reservoir in the mouth of the Yangtze estuary. So there are many cases in the world today where you could address a whole range of problems, not just water quality as I've referred to here, but also flooding issues by holding the water back at the top of the catchment through dams built specifically to address flooding problems, but not building dams upstream to supply water for water supply. I lived in Cardiff for the last 25 years of my life. The water for Cardiff comes from reservoirs right at the top of the catchments in the Brecon Beacons, and that water is then transported some, probably not far short of 40 kilometres down to the city of Cardiff. There is a big freshwater lake now in Cardiff. The mouth of the estuary in Cardiff has been shut off with a barrier called the Cardiff Bay Barrage. And that lake consists of fresh water right at the centre of the city. Well, not quite at the centre, but very close to the centre of the city. If you were building a water supply system for Cardiff today, you would take the water off from the reservoir right at the heart of the city centre, rather than take it from reservoirs up 40 kilometres upstream. And you would use those reservoirs today for flood management of the rivers. And in the recent storms, many of the communities along the River Taff, which is the particular river I'm talking about, were very badly affected about 2 months ago by flooding. I went down there myself to do a TV programme.
Okay, interesting stuff. There's obviously many different elements to think about here. Another question here is about about global action, really, I suppose. Do you see any global scale cooperation in water security anytime soon? I guess that's a bit of a high level question there.
Well, one of the reasons I most enjoy giving this talk, because you educate the public, and I think we need to do a lot more to educate the public. That the public don't think about the consequences of wearing a different dress every day of the week, for example, and they don't. And when you tell people about the consequences and their impacts on other countries, it's quite rewarding, because I think people do think twice about it. I did try quite hard several years ago through the International Association of Hydraulic Research I was president at the time, and we did have meetings with the European Union to see if we could get companies who are supplying clothes, for example, I won't mention the companies, that would be wrong of me to do so, to mark the clothes so that if you were buying a dress or a shirt, and you were told that, a bit like the fair trade issue, but instead of the fair trade issue, it was that the clothes you were buying, the water was treated to a high standard before it went back into the river. Now, it was very difficult for one company to take the lead. But I think if one company took the lead, it would be a bit like the fair trade coffee issue about 2 decades ago, because once one of the companies, I know which company it was, but I better not mention them, introduced the fair trade issue, it's all of a sudden people were happy to pay more for the coffee and feel that the people that were producing that coffee were paid a fair salary. So what I would like to see is that the similar principle applied to companies. I would much rather pay more for my shirts, for example. I'm not wishing to imply I'm flush with cash, but I would rather pay more and feel that the shirt was produced by water in a country which can produce cotton and mine can't, and that the water was returned to the river at a much higher quality, at a very high quality level, and much higher than now. And I think that would do a lot and far more to save lives in many countries in the world than many of the issues that have been done in the past.
So we need some big company leaders, I guess, who take a bit of a stand like they did with the coffee, I guess. I
tried with a big company, but maybe I need to try and do it through something like the Society for the Environment.
Maybe there's a interesting discussion coming up. Maybe, who knows? So the next question links to what we've just been speaking about. Really, the question's around: do you think there is enough interest in the water footprint, and for example, cotton manufacture and so on? And I guess the answer is probably no on that. There isn't enough interest at the moment. But I wanted to expand on that, I guess.
Well, I've always been the born enthusiast. I think it needs people like myself, all of us, the 151 participants here, to go out and tell the world. Presumably a large number of them are water environmentalists, engineers and so forth, to tell the world the importance of things like the water footprint. And we shouldn't just be looking at the carbon footprint. The carbon footprint is extremely important, don't get me wrong. But I think we should also be looking at the water footprint, because what we do in this country, in my country, has an effect on water quality and flooding potential, etc., etc. I can go through a long list of things in a country like India, for example, or Egypt, or Uzbekistan, and so forth. People in Europe who bought cotton before have led to Kazakhstan, for example, losing one of its massive water resources, the Aral Sea, which has now huge impact on the quality of life for the people in that country. So I do think people are interested in water quality, water security. I do think it's a global issue. And I think the more people that speak about it and educate the public, the better. And I find very often when I go to schools and give talks to school children, they are very interested in these issues. And another point, I think women in particular are particularly keen on these issues. And in fact, when I was at Cardiff University, we had nearly 50% of the PhD students in the Hydro-Environmental Research Centre, which I was leading at the time, which had about 40 to 50 students and postdocs, were women. If you looked at civil engineering structures section, they were mainly men. So I believe that in general, not all cases of course, but in general, if we want to attract more women into engineering, then water security is one of the most attractive and appealing subjects to women in my experience.
So that's a strong call to action to us as environment people that are interested in the environment for a start, to talk to more and more people about this issue. So I'm going to finish on this. We are running out of time, so I'm just going to finish on this question. I'm aware we've got quite a few questions. If you want to send these through to me afterwards, please feel free to do so, and we'll hopefully get some answers. So this last question is, we are working with the Rivers Trust on rivers fit to swim to get inland bathing areas recognised. What do you think we should be testing and focusing on to improve inland bathing areas?
Well, actually, I don't know who's asked that question, but I'd be very grateful if they could contact me directly. Because I'm also involved in the wharf in Yorkshire. It's well away from the coast. And in the summer months, there are pictures of literally, well, I would say hundreds, but certainly tens of children, little children, paddling in the river. There are high levels of fecal coliform, E. coli in the river if it's rained a couple of days before. There's sewage CSO discharges into the river as well, and it is a major concern. And there is an application at the moment with DEFRA to try to apply bathing water standards to this site along the river wharf around Ilkley where I live. So I'm particularly interested in whoever's asked that question. If they could contact me directly.
Okay, no problem at all. I've just had to skip through the questions, and there's one here that interests me quite a lot. So I'm going to answer this one. Are there any global schemes similar to carbon credits for virtual water? Not
yet, but I'm keen that we should try and do something like that.
Okay, that will caught my attention. So
I have had discussions with a yogurt producing company, German yogurt producing company, on that issue. And they have a lot of muscle. I better not name the company.
Okay, but possibilities are out there, so that's good.
Yes.
Right, so thank you very much for that, Roger.
And thank you very much to all the participants who've, and I hope that it's been a useful webinar.
I'm certainly sure it has been. Thank you very much for your time. Before everybody disappears, we have some opportunities that you might be interested in. So the first one is on your screen at the moment. Part 4 of this webinar series is coming up next week. If you head over to our website to register, if you haven't already done so, now's the time to do that. So please register for the next part of the series. Next month, we have a World Environment Day Biodiversity Special. World Environment Day is something we champion as a society for the environment every year in and around the 5th of June. The Biodiversity Umbrella webinar topic links directly to the Biodiversity Global Theme for World Environment Day for 2020, which is set by UN Environment. Alongside the webinar series, we're also developing a biodiversity toolkit to give the next generation, the general public, and environmental professionals ideas to help biodiversity locally and globally. The hub will be launched very, very soon. In fact, it'll be launched on Friday this week. and we'd love for you to be involved. So please keep an eye out for the communications on that. And later this year, we have our next series after that, so series 7, which is looking at the topic of natural capital. We're hoping to do that in around September. So if you're a chartered environmentalist or registered environmental technician and you have a project that you'd like to showcase and allow other environmental professionals to learn from, or some top tips for other sectors to consider in their work, or guidance and so on, if you're interested in being involved, please do get in touch with me. We'd love you to be a part of that particular webinar series, like Roger has been for this series. If you're interested to hear more about the CEnv and REnvTech registers, please take a look at our how to become and why become recorded webinars on our website. You'll also find all the recordings from our last series, which was a sustainable built environment. And they'll be joined by the recording of this webinar very shortly, alongside the first 2 parts of this series. They're also available on the Society for the Environment YouTube channel, where you can subscribe to gain notifications of new webinars, new webinar recordings coming up, and other Society for the Environment content. If you're waiting for the recording from the last 2 weeks to appear, we experienced some technical issues with the first part, which means we've had to re-record some of the content, but we hope to release this content very, very shortly. And that's about it from us. So thank you very much for listening and taking part. If you are watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to gain notifications. Many thanks again to Roger for spending some time with us today and providing an excellent talk. Thank you again for that. And we shall see you in the next webinar, which is next week, where we'll be talking about all things, careers and the impact of woodlands and so on climate change. So thank you very much for watching again. Please do stay safe, and we shall see you in the next webinar. Thank you.